Hi, my name is Shelley Bernhard, author of A Real Mother. Today I'm doing an interview with Kathy Robertson O'Neal. Before I go any further, I want to say that this interview is not appropriate for children. I have heard from so many grieving parents about the loss of their child. And although I will be doing several interviews on this topic with people of various ages, today I want to focus on Kathy and her beautiful daughter, Abigail. Kathy talks to groups and schools and special events about her experience, and she offers suggestions and guidance and hope for what grieving parents are going through. I immediately connected with Kathy because of her willingness to be open, grounded, down to earth, loving, insightful, very kind when I was going through a difficult time. So I want to say that although this interview is somewhat different, it is also an interview of hope. And many of you who lived in Colorado in 2007 may have heard of this case. And with that being said, I want to introduce Kathy O'Neal. Thank you, Kathy, for being here today. I so appreciate it. I know it is difficult, and I just know that you can offer some guidance and help for others that are going through what you have gone through. I guess I'd like to start by you just telling us a little bit about your daughter, Abigail, just her personality and what kind of young lady she was.
All right. Well, she was, how to explain Abigail? My sons would tell you that she was, when she walked into the room, she was the light that walked into the room. She was full of life. She was very kind and very and loving. She was always for the underdog. Always for the underdog. If there was, I remember there was one time when she was in college and she had met this young woman who became a very good friend of hers, who had a rare disease, and I can't remember the name of this disease, but she was in a wheelchair. And Abigail was drawn to that young woman immediately, and they became very good friends. And I remember the day that Abigail brought that young woman home to meet me. This young girl couldn't walk. And so I remember my daughter carrying this young girl into my house. And she said, "Mom, I want you to meet Kaylin." And I said, "Oh, well, hello. Hi, Kaylin." And Abigail sat her down on the chair. And that was just the kind of person Abigail was. I remember when Abigail died, one of my sister-in-law said to me, not every girl would have befriended Kaylin and would have been so friendly to Kaylin, because it wasn't an easy thing. So that just gave you an example of what the kind of girl Abigail was. She brought home stray puppies. Stray cats. That's who Abigail was.
Yeah, I think Kathy, I in reading, a few years ago about the case and that kind of thing, that when she was in the 7th grade, her teacher had said that Abigail was one of the sweetest girls she had ever known, and that she just thought so much of her, that she just had this huge heart. So that pretty much describes her. not to mention she was physically beautiful. She was beautiful on the inside as well. I wanted to start right off about you telling our audience about relationship violence versus domestic violence and why that terminology has changed.
Well, I think that domestic violence has always been viewed by everyone as a crime that affects women who are married with children. And so I think when this became something that was that was out there in the media, I think they needed to bring a different put a different name on it, because they needed people to understand that relationship violence happens to high school girls, it happens to high school boys, it happens to of course, my daughter was in college when this happened to her, and so they wanted to put a different name on it so that people understood that this was a problem that was happening to our young people, young people in our country.
Right, right.
And I think that's where they tried to separate the two, the domestic violence, which has always been, people think of it as a married problem, a couple's problem. And
yes,
I think that's kind of where this all began. It's labeling it relationship violence.
Okay. I would next like to ask you about Abigail's death, and if you could tell us what happened.
Sure.
And about well, let's start with that horrific night, and then from there, or during the course of that, you can go into how long she had been away from this ex-boyfriend and how he was stalking her.
Okay.
And why the restraining order was put upon him, and what's with the restraining orders? They just don't work. So if you could talk about that, that would be great.
Okay. All right. Well, I think maybe we'll start with the relationship, because it's kind of, and then we'll go into how it all ended.
That's perfect.
Yeah, she met this young man. He was the resident assistant on the floor of the dorm that she was living in Denver. She was actually going to school at Metropolitan State College, and she was living in one of the dorms. And she became involved with this young man, and during the course of their relationship, he became very controlling and very domineering, and she ended the relationship. She ended the relationship in either June or July of 2007. And the breakup was what started the whole series of events that led to her death. Mm-hmm. He did not handle the breakup well, and he started stalking and harassing her. And there was actually one incident at her apartment where he threw up against the wall and he hit her. Mm-hmm. And her roommates walked out at that time, and so then he stopped and proceeded to go down to the parking lot where her car was parked, and he totaled her car. He keyed every inch of her car.
My gosh.
At that point, my daughter got my ex-husband and I involved, and I took her to the Glendale Police Department that following Monday, and we pressed charges against Marcus. And at that point, he was put in jail. He was arrested and put in jail, and a restraining order was issued by the courts. for him to stay away from her. They were actually going to college at that time, and they were, both there on the Auraria campus in Denver. They were there, at the same time, and so he actually had an ankle bracelet around his ankle,
Wow.
where he was actually not supposed to get within, I can't even remember how many feet that he was supposed to stay, but he was not supposed to contact her or be around her at all. During that time, he did all kinds of things that I won't go into, but stalking and harassing her.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as how I feel about a restraining order, because I get asked this every time I speak publicly about Abigail's death and what happened, I think they are worthless. I do,
Mm-hmm.
but I also understand that they are part of the process, and there has to be some kind of legal trail and some kind of a legal there, and for that purpose, I am in favor of restraining orders, because when you finally do go to trial for something like this, you got to have there's got to be that paper trail that you did actually take those steps. So in that regard, I do feel like restraining orders are necessary. Do they work? As you can see, I'll go into that a little bit further, but no, they don't keep the perpetrator away from the victim. The perpetrator, if he wants to do harm to her, he will find a way to do harm to her.
Find a way.
And which is what my ex-husband and I found out. Abby, after several months of being harassed and stalked by this young man, on December 11th, the day after her 21st birthday, he walked into her apartment. It was in the afternoon. It was about 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and he stabbed her multiple times, and he shot her 4 times, which resulted in her death.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, it's just horrible. Was she living alone at the time, Kathy?
No, she actually had 2 roommates, and he had been sitting out in front of her apartment for, I don't know how long, but probably several minutes, and he had been waiting. And once her roommates walked out, this was during, they were all in finals that week because this was before Christmas, and the roommates had walked out of the apartment, and they were going to go down to the office of the apartment complex to make copies of the work that they'd been doing. And he had been sitting there watching, and once they walked out, he walked in.
Oh my gosh.
That's when he killed her. So again, he had planned this.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. It's just so horrific that this happens. And I just can't even imagine. Then who found her? Did her roommates then find her?
No, because the young man that killed her, he actually called 911. He took her telephone and he actually called 911 and pretended to be a neighbor across the yard from their complex, and told the police that there was he felt like there was something that had happened in Abigail's apartment, and so the police were called. He did many things like that.
Oh my gosh!
Which eventually is what convicted him, because he did just really dumb things like that. But anyway, he called the police, and they came and found her. And then at that point, they sealed off the apartment, and it was a crime scene. And the roommates were never allowed to go back in that apartment ever.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when were you notified?
We were notified. My ex-husband and I were notified probably at about 6 o'clock that evening. But we had already been contacted. It's so funny with Facebook and
yes.
telephone, and most of Abby's friends knew about her death before my ex-husband and I did,
Oh my
because
gosh.
the roommates knew. Roommates were there at the scene. They weren't allowed to go back into the apartment, but they were there at the scene, so they knew what had happened. And of course, the roommates were taken to the police department right after it was happened too. And so they were calling, texting all their friends. And then all of a sudden, their friends started calling and texting us.
Oh my gosh, Kathy.
And so we actually were not notified by the police until that evening. It had snowed that day, and the police had a hard time getting to the Glendale Police Department. Was supposed to get to us, but they ended up calling the Lafayette Police Department to come and tell us. And so, yeah,
Oh my gosh.
we were told by the police department, but we knew.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Wow. What what about Abigail? How long was it after this happened that the trial took place?
It took place 3 years after, and in the state of Colorado, that's pretty typical for a first-degree murder trial.
Uh-huh.
It takes a long time to put together a first-degree murder trial, and you have to go through all these court proceedings, and it's just a long, drawn-out process. And so it was about 3 years.
Now, did he turn himself in, or what?
He did actually turn himself in. He didn't admit to the crime. He came up with this idea in his head, and he went to the Aurora Police Department and told them that he had just been diagnosed with narcolepsy and had had a blackout and was afraid that he had hurt his ex-girlfriend. So he was technically in jail from that day on. That day forward.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Can you talk a little bit about Abigail's trial and your some of the similarities in these cases that seem to be very much alike?
Yeah, it's when I started my foundation, Abby's Voice, and I got really involved in this whole relationship violence genre in this country. I got very active in it, and there's girls all across the country that have been killed very similar to the way Abby was killed. It's pretty textbook when you read about some of these girls and the way they were killed. A lot of times they're stabbed, and a lot of times it's very textbook. Very similar. There's so many similarities. It's usually a fit of rage, and which the perpetrator is usually in a state of rage, and that's why there are so many times when these girls are killed that there's multiple stabbings, and that they're it's very textbook.
Wow, very interesting. Going back to the trial, how long did the trial take?
It was almost 3 weeks. It was almost 3 weeks by the time they finished, both sides finished up. It wasn't quite 2 weeks, but it was very close to 3 weeks.
Can you talk a little bit about what you said in the courtroom about the murder and about her former boyfriend that committed this heinous crime, and what you said to him, and how the press really picked up on that?
Well, through the whole process, we during the 3-week process, and really the 3-year process of by the time you actually go to trial, you learn so many things about the mental state of the perpetrator. And we learned over that course of time that Marcus, who killed Abigail, he came from a very broken family. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army, which nobody knew.
Wow.
Things came out like his mental health and his family situation. And the thing that bothered me so much about that trial was my noticing that there was not one family member that came to Marcus's side in that trial. His parents, neither one of his parents were there. His grandmother who raised him wasn't there. There was nobody on that side of the court. And it just kept coming back to me the whole time that we were sitting there. Where were his people? Where were the people that loved him and that cared for him? Because they weren't there. And I just became so saddened by that. I thought, oh my God, Abigail's side of the courtroom was packed. I mean, as a matter of fact, there were people that couldn't even get into the courtroom. That were outside in the halls during her trial because they wanted to be a part of that trial so badly. But he had nobody on his side. And I just, in my heart, that's where I felt that it was the reason we were where we were. I just felt like nobody cared about this young man, and that's the reason why he did what he did. And I don't know why I took that approach and I felt that way about it, but it was just so incredibly sad to me. And people don't understand, that we had a relationship with this young man. He came to our home. I thought he was a nice young man. I remember looking at him thinking, you are a sweet young man. And so there is this emotional, side to all of this. And it's the side that my daughter felt too, because when we would talk to my daughter about Marcus and the restraining order and that we wanted to press charges and we wanted to, she would look at me and say, Mom, I don't want you to do that. I just want him to leave me alone. And so there is this aspect of this that she cared about him too.
And it's almost like, I really don't have any idea, but as I'm sitting here listening to you, your family may have been the family he never had. And so he attached and became connected with all of you. And when Abigail broke that off, he lost any hope of anything he might have had in his life.
Well, I definitely think he felt that way about her. Totally. I totally do. Because he wrote her letters, and that there were letters that came out in the trial, and I totally think that he did feel that way about her.
And it says a lot about, there's so much we can't foresee or prevent happening to our children. But in you talking about Marcus, the fact that he didn't have any support, not even one person, the importance of having at least one person in your life that loves you and believes in you and is by your side as a child, the importance of parenting. So you had actually talked to him in court and spoke about this, and the media really just held on to this.
I did, because when they sentenced him to life in prison, they give the opportunity for the family to speak, the victims to speak, whatever
Right,
they
right.
for. And my ex-husband didn't want to get up there, and I felt compelled to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I needed to talk. I needed to speak. I needed to speak my mind, and I did get up there in front of him, and I can't remember exactly what I said to him, but I said, Marcus, what was this all for? If you had only given it more time, the pain of the breakup would have subsided. And I said, 2 lives were lost that day, yours and Abigail's.
Mm-hmm.
And I also said to him, Marcus, where were your people?
Right.
I said, where were your people? And if you had maybe had people in your life, we wouldn't be where we are today. And I just, and there was actually people from the press that were sitting in I think everyone felt so amazed that I had sympathy for Marcus.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that they, um, that they focused on, was that
Right, right.
I didn't scream and yell at him, and and during this whole process, everyone has always asked me why I didn't hate him or haven't been angry about, you know, there's so many different ways you can go with grief. You can focus on the anger part of grief, which I didn't have the energy for. I did not have the energy for the
Right,
hate
right.
and the anger. I only had the energy for the sadness and my missing my daughter so terribly. And that's the only thing I had the energy for. And hating Marcus was something that I just didn't have the energy for, and I still don't. It just, and my ex-husband was the same way. We both just we didn't focus on the anger. We focused on moving on, and in our minds, in my ex-husband and I's mind, the sentence of life in prison was, it was
Uh-huh.
we both felt justified with
Right,
that.
right. Absolutely. Absolutely. How how have you gotten, well, maybe this is, you answered some of this, is by not carrying around hate for Marcus and that sort of thing, that has somewhat helped in your healing. You're not going to ever heal completely, but it helped you to be able to focus on what was most important, and that was Abigail
It did.
and your family. Yeah.
And I will tell you that from a grieving parent's perspective, it's absolutely the worst thing that you can ever go through. Uh, in your life, you know that there is a possibility I will lose my spouse.
Mm-hmm.
There is a big possibility I will lose my parents.
Yes.
But it never dawns on you, and you never say to yourself that you will lose one of your children, because as a parent, it is your worst nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I, I think that the only way I could get through this was by starting my foundation. And I became, as one of my friends said, who helped me start my foundation, she said, you became a force to be reckoned with. And that's kind of what I did. I just decided to take all this energy and all this grief and put it into making this something positive. And I had to be Abby's voice. I had to be her voice. I had to be the person that went out there and told her story, so that nobody else, so that I could maybe just save one girl from having this happen to her. And that became I was obsessed with it. It's how I got through her death.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that I didn't have many, many days when I didn't feel like I could get out of bed, because there were many days. And but it gave me a purpose. And that's how I did it. That's how I did it.
Tell us a little bit about the foundation.
Well, I focused on education, and I kept thinking in my mind, had my ex-husband and I been educated on the warning signs of an abusive relationship, maybe my ex-husband and I would have done things differently. And I also kept focusing on if her friends had been educated about what the warning signs were of an abusive relationship, maybe they would have done things differently. And so I put together a video where I interviewed all my daughter's friends, and they all told their side of the story and how they felt about all of it. And in each one of what each one of them said was they didn't really understand the relationship and what was going on. And I also started getting involved in domestic violence. I got involved in safe shelters around the Lafayette, Longmont area. I got involved in the college, the college, Metropolitan State College. I got involved in that. I got involved in so many nonprofits that focused on domestic violence, and I just learned.
And what have you learned about the nonprofits in doing this?
Well, I learned that there's a huge need for this issue, and I also learned how prevalent it is, how prevalent domestic violence is, and relationship violence. And I learned that it was, I became a very good public speaker, which is something I never would have ever thought that I would be. I can pretty much speak about this issue in front of anybody, and I've become very passionate about it. It is, I just feel very strongly that it's something that I need to do, and it's something that I need to speak out about.
Well, what about in speaking about this and your work on this, what about teaching something in the schools as even in college or high school, something about this topic? Because at one point, if I recall, you even talked to Jared Polis about
I did.
this. Yeah.
I did. I went to the beginning of my days working with my foundation. There was a movement going across the country for mothers, and they were called, and this sounds awful, but I remember one mother called it the Murdered Daughters Club. And so there was many mothers across the United States that we all kind of got in touch with each other and started emailing each other and talking to each other. And the movement was that we wanted to get a bill passed in every state in the United States that made relationship violence curriculum mandatory in all the schools. And there is a woman in Rhode Island, her name is Anna Burke, and her daughter was killed very similar to the way Abby was killed. And she started this movement, and she actually got that law passed in the state of, maybe it wasn't Rhode Island, maybe it was Delaware. I think it was Delaware.
Okay.
Anyway, she got this law passed where date violence curriculum was mandatory. And that's what I was talking to Jared Polis about. I went there to talk to Jared Polis. I talked to several other congressmen there that day, too. I talked to Diana DeGette. Anyway, my purpose of being there was to get a bill passed in the state of Colorado that would make it mandatory for date violence curriculum to be in the schools. And I remember Jared Polis telling me, yes, Kathy, you could do this, but it's going to be very hard. And because technically in the state of Colorado, for me to do that, I would have had we would have had to rewrite the Constitution in Colorado, because right now the state constitution says that every school board has the right to dictate what their curriculum was. And so I would have had to jump all kinds of
Wow.
hurdles in order to do it. And I just didn't have the money, the resources, or the energy to do that. So I focused my energy on going to the schools, and I went to several schools in the Boulder County area and in Denver. And I did presentations in the school. And I've done that for years. I don't do it anymore, but I did it many, many times. There were several high schools that had me there every time that they did do a series on relationship violence. So there was definitely schools in the Boulder County area and in Denver that did offer this kind of curriculum.
Now, so this is a state by state issue. So this Anna Burke was able to do this in Delaware.
I'm pretty sure it was Delaware. Yes. Yeah, she was, and she got it passed.
And at what age did they decide that this would be a good age to start teaching this?
I believe it was in high school. I think her program is in high school, and it's usually in the health class that they teach.
In the health class, yeah. Okay.
There's many other states that have this law. Nebraska has it. Nebraska has the law where I think it's the Lindsay Ann Burke law, and don't quote me on that one, but it is definitely, there are several states in the United States that do, there has to be some kind of relationship violence curriculum in the schools. Colorado is not one of them. And I wish that I had pursued that. I really wish I had pursued that stronger. But you learn to figure out what you can handle and what you can't as far as your energy levels. And I just decided that I was just going to concentrate on going and speaking to the schools.
Which in itself is very effective.
Yes, and it totally was. It was so interesting. I loved doing it. I loved it. Because I felt like I was making a difference, and sometimes I was, definitely.
Did you get a lot of questions from students that you spoke to that
all the time
just didn't know anything about this, just didn't have any understanding about it?
Just about every time I spoke, I would have a young woman walk up to me after I spoke and start talking to me about the relationships they were in, and they didn't realize that they were in an abusive relationship. I had a couple scary relationship talks with some girls that were definitely being abused.
Gosh.
There was a time I spoke in a school in Denver, and it was one of the rougher schools in Denver. And her teacher was very concerned about this young woman, which is the reason this teacher contacted me to begin with, because she knew that I did this. She knew that I went around to the school, and she contacted me and said, I've got a couple of girls in some of my classes that could really benefit from you coming and speaking, and so we would love to have you come speak. And that young woman I was very concerned about, and I even actually called the principal the next day and said, if you don't do something about this, I'm going to call the police. And I remember the teacher reaching out to me a year later saying that young girl got help. She got away from this young man, and it was definitely beneficial for me to have come and talked to the class, because in the curriculum, in my presentation, I always spoke to these young girls and boys, because boys can be in abusive relationships too. I talked to them all about what a healthy relationship looks like and what an unhealthy relationship looks like, and sometimes they don't know the difference.
My gosh,
that was always very interesting.
Well, we're taught so much when we're in school, but there's so many basic things And then, like what you're talking about, and sex education that I personally feel need to be taught that are not spoken about. They're just taboo. And those, it seems like our education system, just like parenting, needs to set us up in some way for the real world, for life experience.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's just it's heartbreaking to think about what these girls go through. Some may never get out of this, and boys, but and how this cycle just probably repeats itself over and over and over and over. So by setting up this foundation and talking the way you have, and like this Anna Burke and Lindsay doing this work, how effective you've been in being able to help people. What? Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, I don't remember what I was going to say. You said something that I thought about. Domestic violence, you brought this up. Domestic violence and relationship violence, these are issues that people don't want to talk about.
Right.
They're not, it's not a happy issue. And I've gone to many presentations and I've done many presentations where I can see the faces of some of the mothers in the crowd and some of the people in the crowd. And I can see them saying to themselves, this is never going to happen to me. And domestic violence is something that we sweep under the rug. And it happens to all walks of life and all economic. It's not something that only happens to poor women. It happens to rich women. It happens to every economic, and it's swept under the rug a lot of times and not talked about. It's not something you want to talk about because most often the victims are very ashamed of what's going on, and the perpetrators put fear into these victims, not to tell anyone.
Right.
It's how they control them.
Well, and it's a form of abuse.
It is, and it's a form of bullying, and it is, and it's embarrassing. My daughter didn't want to tell people about the things that were going on with her relationship. She didn't want to tell my ex-husband and I. She didn't want to tell her friends, and so she isolated herself. And he didn't want her to be around anybody. He isolated her, and that's a very typical sign of domestic violence.
Absolutely. Can you touch on the bullying a little bit?
Well, I think they need to. I think it's very similar. I think that bullying is a form of somebody having power over someone else. And that's why I think in the schools, bullying curriculum and relationship violence curriculum need to be combined. And they need to be
go hand in hand.
One whole series. And it needs to be talked about how it's not cool to talk this way to someone, and what needs to be said is if someone is talking to you this way, that's not cool to take. It's a whole series of issues that need to be really dealt with in the public schools.
Well, I can see absolutely those go hand in hand, and the schools, and I even hear people in the general public talk about, the bullying has gotten so much better. No, it hasn't. It is alive and well, and in some ways worse than ever. And so I don't know. I think our system needs to do a better job. People, not all people. Some people are very good at looking the other way. Being able to just walk away and pretend that they didn't see something, or maybe they thought they saw something, but they don't want to pursue it. And people need to speak up. Yeah, because it's very real, and a lot of people carry that pain their entire lives.
Oh yeah. Yep.
What? Tell me a little bit as you're talking to the schools, the difference that you see in the boys and the girls in terms of um, date violence and that kind of thing.
Well, the girls are much more apt to talk to me about it now. But usually when I went into all of the classrooms, the boys asked questions too. They they asked questions, and but I found that the girls were more. And it also depended on what school I was at. It depended,
Yeah. Right.
The reactions to this issue were totally different in some of the inner city schools in Colorado, in Denver,
Sure.
versus the schools in the suburbs. It was a totally different. It was a totally different feeling that I got from the boys. I remember being in an inner city school in Denver, and we were talking about this issue, and this one young man, he started arguing with me about, well, this is the way the girls should be talked to and treated.
Oh, wow.
It was an eye opener to me.
Well, he was seeing something at home. Perhaps he was seeing.
I'm pretty sure that's the way his father talked to his mother.
Yeah.
And it's a very difference of culture and how we're all raised. And but it was the thing that I always noticed with every class that I talked to was that I was getting them to think about this issue.
Yeah.
And that was my message, and that was what was important.
So important, Kathy. So important. And well, we're talking about male versus female. Tell me a little bit about what you learned through the grieving process. Not that you'll ever get over it, but between your ex-husband and yourself, male and female, and how they handle grief differently.
Well, both men and women grieve so totally different. Women tend to vocalize their grief, and they tend to talk to their friends about it. They tend to. I talked about it constantly because that's just who I am, and it's how I dealt with it. My ex-husband internalized it, and I didn't really understand that until the end of my marriage, and my marriage fell apart. And there are statistics out there that 90% of marriages do not survive the death of a child. It changes the dynamic of your relationship, and a lot of times there's resentment and anger on both sides. That wasn't the way my ex-husband and I dealt with it, but it definitely was. We just did it so differently, and it isn't always easy to, even though you try to get each other through it.
Yes.
You both just do it. You just process it so differently. And I'm beginning to think that maybe that's why so many marriages do fail with the
Absolutely. I mean, communication is the key in every marriage, and every marriage is difficult, no matter what they say. It's not easy, and so if there's not communication and something this horrific happens and the communication isn't there, I can understand it can sometimes be easier not to talk about it. I don't know.
Yep.
What about your two sons?
Well, it devastated both of them. My older son was about 24 at the time of Abby's death, and no, actually he was 25 or 26 because he was 6 years older than Abby. He reacted totally different than my younger son. My younger son was 12, and it
Mhm.
devastated both of them, but in different ways.
Mhm.
My older son kind of got on a plane and went to Washington, D.C., and kind of dealt with it on his own, whereas my younger son dealt with it. He was still in the house. And so my ex-husband and I, we had to, thank goodness for my boys. That's the one thing that I am so thankful for, that we had our boys, because
Right.
they were the reason for us to keep going.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think my older son, and I can't speak for my older son, but I think that um, he got on a plane and went to Washington, D.C., and then just kind of had to deal with this on his own. Whereas my younger son, we rallied, we worked really hard to get my younger son through this.
Oh,
So
boy. Yeah, because he was still a child at 12.
he was 12. He was
Yeah.
12. And
Yeah.
to this day, both of my boys are still very affected um, with all of this. It changes everything. It changes
Absolutely.
you. It changes. I'm no longer the person that I was before this
Right.
happened.
Right.
We're all changed.
Yeah.
But there were silver linings. There were silver linings. My younger son, he wants to be a psychologist. He wants to help people. It's made him into, both of my sons, it's made them into very caring young men.
How
So
wonderful for that.
yeah.
Um, it seems like very often when this happens, nobody, friends and other family members, they don't want to talk about the person who has died, and then it seems like the parents, it's very important for them to talk about it, and like you were saying, you needed to do that, but what would your advice be to people that don't know what to say, and so they end up saying the wrong thing, not deliberately, but because they don't know what to say? Or what advice would you give them on what would be helpful for them to say to you?
Well, I think the biggest thing that you just have to do when you're dealing with somebody that's grieving, is just listen. You just have to listen to them. You don't know how they feel, and you're never going to know how they feel.
No.
And but what you need to do, what anybody who's grieving really wants, is just to talk. They just want to talk about what has happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the hardest thing for a parent losing a child is that child is going to be lost to the world, and people will forget her. People will forget her, and people will, because everyone else goes on with their lives. And I remember thinking in the early parts of this process, I didn't want her to be forgotten. And every parent who loses a child feels that way. And the reason, that I created the foundation was that so she would not have been forgotten. And every parent that's grieving, and every handles it in a different way, and they do different things to get through their grief. But for me, that's how I did it. And as far as people talking to you, when you are grieving, you want to talk about that person that you've lost. You just want to. And you just have to listen. I think the biggest thing to do for a friend that is grieving is just listen to them. You don't have to fix their problem, because you can't fix it.
Right.
You can't fix it. But all you can do for your friend or your loved one is just listen. Just listen to them talk. And
Yeah.
I think that's the most important thing.
What about the foundation was very important for you, and I can understand how that would be so important for you in keeping Abby's memory alive for you to reach out and help other people. What advice might you give other parents? Maybe the very same thing in terms of the loss of a child and what might be helpful for them. Certainly, you've said talking about it.
Well, I think doing something special, having some kind of a ceremony to honor that child. I think it's real important. Whether you have some kind of a ceremony on that child's birthday, or I think it's very important that you honor that child and do activities that honor that child. You hear stories about people letting balloons out in the air in honor of that child, and those kind of things help you in the grieving process. Again, it's all about that remembering your child.
Right. Are there any last words you'd like to say to people that would be helpful? Anything that would be helpful for yourself that people can do?
I just think that grieving the loss of a child or the loss of anyone, because I know that you struggled with your brother and you still do. Grief it's a process that we have to go through, and it's a normal process. And I think the people they will get through it, and they will come to the other side of it. But for everybody, it takes. Everybody does it differently. Everybody does it on their own time. There is no time frame as to when you will be through grief. You talked a little bit about holidays. Still, on the day of the anniversary of Abigail's death.
Right, I just had that on Thursday, yeah. But
you go through the whole thing over and over again. And I've just learned to just be okay with that and just take that day and just grieve that day, because it's the anniversary. It just don't you find that it just all comes back to you? You just go through it, the whole thing.
I do, Kathy, and I can't compare the loss of my brother with your loss. Very different to lose a child. There's just no doubt about it. But it is funny. A couple days before, I thought, why am I so edgy and why am I so kind of pissed off?
Yeah.
And then I realized, oh my God, it's going to be the 26th.
Yeah.
And then that night I couldn't sleep because I went through every single thing. And it was just like, wow. And then a couple days later, it levels off again.
It does.
It's a very interesting process how our brains work. And but to compare that with the loss of a child, you just can't. Kathy, I'm so sorry that you've had to go through this, and I mean that so sincerely. I'm so sorry.
Oh, well, thank you.
And I want to thank you so much for doing this interview.
You are so welcome. I'm so thrilled that you asked me to do it.
And you send me that email address.
Okay.
And I'll put it up when Nicholas gets the interview up and going, hopefully today. Okay. And I will call you probably tomorrow.
Okay. All right.
Kathy,
sounds good.
I hope the rest of your day goes well. Love you. Bye.
Love you too. Thank you so much, Shelley.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.